The scream tore through the stillness of the Texas afternoon just as Garrett Hayes rode past the weathered farmhouse, a sound so raw and desperate that it stopped him cold in the saddle. It was March of 1882, and the drought had turned the land around San Angelo into a dusty graveyard of failed crops and broken dreams. But that cry carried something beyond ordinary suffering. It carried the primal agony of childbirth mixed with terror, and before his mind could fully process what he was hearing, another sound followed, the slam of a door and raised voices sharp with anger. Garrett was a man who minded his own business. At 26 years old, he had learned that survival in West Texas meant keeping your head down and your hands busy with your own troubles. He had been riding back to the ranch where he worked after picking up supplies in town, his saddlebags heavy with flour and coffee, his mind occupied with thoughts of the fence line that needed mending before the weekend. But something about that scream pulled at him in a way he could not ignore, some fundamental wrongness that made his gut clench and his hands tighten on the reins. He guided his horse, a sturdy paint mare named Dusty, toward the house just as the front door burst open. A young woman stumbled out onto the porch, her face contorted in pain, one hand clutching her swollen belly while the other braced against the doorframe. She was maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair plastered to her forehead, with sweat and a simple cotton dress soaked through. Behind her, a gray-haired woman who must have been her mother stood rigid in the doorway, her face twisted with disgust and rage. "You will not bring your shame into this house," the older woman shouted, her voice carrying across the yard. "I will not have you birthing your bastard under my roof." "Mama, please!" The young woman's voice broke on a sob, and then another contraction seized her. She doubled over, crying out, her knees buckling. "Please, I cannot." "You should have thought of that before you spread your legs for that no-good drifter." A man appeared behind the older woman, tall and lean, with the hard face of someone who had spent too many years fighting with the land and losing. "We told you what would happen if you disgraced this family. You made your choice." The young woman tried to straighten, tried to turn back to the door, but her father stepped out and physically blocked her path. "Papa, the baby is coming," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. I need help. Please." "You need to leave." The father's voice was flat, final. "You are no daughter of mine." Garrett had seen some cruel things in his life. He had watched cattle die slow deaths from disease, seen men shot over card games, witnessed the aftermath of Comanche raids back when he was just a boy. But there was something about watching parents turn their backs on their own child in her moment of greatest need that made rage flare hot and bright in his chest. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the hard-packed dirt with purpose as he strode toward the porch. "What in God's name is wrong with you people?" The words came out harder than he intended, but he did not soften them. The father's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "This is none of your concern, stranger. Keep riding." "I am making it my concern." Garrett took the porch steps 2 at a time, reaching the young woman just as her legs gave out completely. He caught her before she hit the ground, his arms going around her trembling body as she sobbed against his chest. Up close, he could see how young she really was, could feel the violent contractions that racked her frame. "She needs help. She needs a midwife, a doctor. She needs to lie in the bed she made," the mother spat. "We are God-fearing people. We will not harbor sin under our roof." The young woman whimpered, her fingers digging into Garrett's shirt as another wave of pain hit. He could feel the dampness soaking through her dress and realized with a jolt of alarm that her water had broken, that this baby was coming, whether anyone was ready or not. He looked from the young woman's agonized face to her parents' stony expressions and made a decision that would change the course of his entire life. "Fine, then she comes with me." He shifted his grip, preparing to lift her. "Take her," the father said coldly. "Take the whore and her bastard and get off my property." Garrett wanted to hit him. His free hand actually curled into a fist, and it took every ounce of self-control he possessed to unclench it. Violence would not help this girl, and she needed help desperately. Instead, he carefully scooped her into his arms, shocked at how light she was despite her pregnancy. She could not have been eating well. "What's your name?" he asked gently as he carried her down the steps. "Sarah," she managed between gasps. "Sarah Whitmore. I am Garrett Hayes. I am going to help you, Sarah. I promise." He could not put her on Dusty in her condition, and they would never make it back to town in time. His own place was too far as well. He bunked in the ranch house with 5 other cowboys, hardly an appropriate place for a woman to give birth. His mind raced as he looked around, taking in the barn set back from the house, the scattered outbuildings. The barn would have to do. Sarah cried out again, her body going rigid in his arms. "I can feel it," she sobbed. "The baby. Oh God, the baby is coming." I know. Just hold on." Garrett moved as quickly as he dared toward the barn, very aware of the 2 figures watching silently from the porch. The door was open, and he kicked it wider, stepping into the dim interior that smelled of hay and leather and horses. A few chickens scattered, clucking indignantly. There was a hayloft above and stalls to one side, but what caught his eye was the small tack room at the back. He carried Sarah there and found it was cleaner than he had hoped, with a workbench and some old blankets folded in a corner. He laid her down as gently as he could on the blankets he spread across the floor, then straightened up, his heart pounding. He was a cowboy, not a doctor. He knew how to birth a calf or a foal, but a human baby. That was entirely different territory. But Sarah was writhing in pain, her dress hitched up around her thighs, and there was no time to ride for help, even if he had wanted to leave her alone, which he did not. "Sarah, listen to me." He knelt beside her, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "I need to see how far along you are. I need to—" "Just do it!" she screamed, and then her scream dissolved into a raw, guttural sound as she bore down. Garrett had never moved so fast in his life. He stripped off his vest and rolled up his sleeves, his hands shaking slightly as he positioned himself. One glance told him everything he needed to know. This baby was coming right now, and there was not a damn thing anyone could do to slow it down. He could see the crown of the baby's head already. Okay, he said, more to himself than to her. "On the next contraction, you need to push. Can you do that?" "I am pushing." Sarah's face was red, her teeth gritted, every muscle in her body straining. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. Garrett found himself talking to her the way he would talk to a spooked horse, his voice low and steady even as his heart hammered against his ribs. He told her she was doing great, that she was strong, that it would be over soon. He had no idea if any of that was true, but it seemed to help. She focused on his voice, on his face, and pushed with everything she had. And then, in a rush of fluid and blood that made Garrett's stomach lurch, the baby slid into his waiting hands. For one horrible second, the infant was silent and still, and Garrett thought he had failed, thought this whole terrible situation was going to end in tragedy. But then the baby sputtered, let out a weak cry that quickly grew stronger, and Garrett released a breath he had not realized he was holding. "It is a boy," he said hoarsely, staring down at the tiny, slippery creature in his hands. "Sarah, you have a son." She was crying, reaching for the baby with trembling arms. Garrett quickly wiped the infant's face with a relatively clean corner of his shirt, then carefully placed him on Sarah's chest. She clutched her son to her, sobbing so hard her whole body shook, and Garrett had to look away for a moment, his own eyes stinging. He had work to do still. He used his knife to cut the umbilical cord. He had seen it done with foals, and he hoped to God it worked the same way with humans, and tied it off with a piece of leather cord from his pocket. The afterbirth came a few minutes later, and Garrett disposed of it outside, his hands covered in blood and his mind reeling. When he came back, Sarah had managed to get the baby to her breast, and the infant was making small snuffling sounds as he tried to nurse. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice raw. "Thank you. I thought we were both going to die." Garrett sank down onto an overturned bucket, suddenly exhausted. "You are both all right. That is what matters." They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the baby's occasional whimpers and the distant clucking of chickens. Garrett's mind was spinning, trying to figure out what came next. He could not just leave them here in a barn. Sarah needed proper medical attention, needed food and rest and someone to watch over her. But where could he take her? Not to her parents, obviously. Not to the ranch. His boss, Mr. Patterson, was a decent enough man, but showing up with a girl he barely knew, and her newborn baby was pushing the boundaries of hospitality. "I do not have anywhere to go," Sarah said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Her face was pale, dark circles under her eyes making her look even younger. "No money, no family who will take me in. Her voice broke. "I do not know what to do." Garrett looked at her, really looked at her. Even exhausted and dirty and tear-stained, there was something compelling about her face. She had delicate features, a stubborn set to her jaw beneath the fear, and eyes that were a startling shade of green. More than that, there was something in the way she held her baby, fierce and protective despite her obvious terror, that made something shift in his chest. "You will come with me," he heard himself say. "I have a line shack about 2 hours' ride from here. It is not much, but it has got 4 walls and a roof and a stove. You can stay there until you figure things out. I cannot ask you to—" "You are not asking. I am offering." He stood up, brushing hay off his pants. "But we need to get you cleaned up first, and you need to rest a bit before we can travel. Can you manage that?" Sarah nodded, clutching her baby closer. "Why are you doing this? You do not even know me." It was a fair question, and Garrett was not entirely sure he had a good answer. He just knew that he could not walk away, could not leave this girl and her baby to fend for themselves. Maybe it was because his own mother had died when he was young, and he had vague memories of his father's tenderness in those early years, before grief and whiskey had turned him mean. Maybe it was simple human decency, or maybe it was something else entirely, something he was not ready to examine too closely. "Let's just say I cannot stand by and watch someone suffer when I can help," he said finally. "Now, let me see if I can find some water and something clean for you and the baby." He spent the next hour scrounging. He found a relatively clean horse blanket in one of the stalls and an old shirt that he tore into strips for the baby. He used water from the pump outside to wet another rag and brought it back so Sarah could clean herself and the infant. He even managed to find half a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth in the main house's outdoor kitchen. He had crept around back while Sarah rested, and thankfully her parents had not appeared to run him off. Sarah ate the bread ravenously, and Garrett gave her water from his canteen. Color slowly returned to her cheeks, though she still looked weak and shaky. The baby had fallen asleep on her chest, wrapped in the torn shirt, his tiny face peaceful. "What is his name?" Garrett asked, crouching down beside them. Sarah gazed at her son, her expression softening. "I have been thinking, Daniel, after my grandfather. He was the only one in the family who was kind to me." Her face hardened slightly. "He died last year. I wish he was still here. He would not have let them throw me out." "Daniel is a good, strong name." "Garrett?" She hesitated, then met his eyes. "I need you to understand something. The father, Daniel's father, he is not coming back. He was a ranch hand passing through last summer. He told me he loved me, that he would marry me, and I believed him." She laughed bitterly. "I was such a fool. When I told him I was pregnant, he left town the next day. I have not seen him since." "You were not a fool. You trusted someone. That is not the same thing. My parents think I am a whore. Maybe they are right. They are wrong." Garrett's voice was sharp enough that she looked up in surprise. "Being young and trusting does not make you a whore. It makes you human. What makes them wrong is turning their backs on their own daughter when she needed them most." Fresh tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, but she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." By late afternoon, Garrett judged that Sarah had recovered enough to travel, at least the distance they needed to go. He had ridden back to where he had left Dusty and retrieved his horse, then fashioned a sling from his spare shirt so Sarah could carry Daniel against her chest while riding. He lifted her onto the saddle. She winced but did not cry out, and swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to steady her. The ride to the line shack was slow and careful. Garrett kept Dusty to a walk, hyper-aware of every bump and dip in the terrain that might cause Sarah pain. She leaned back against him, exhausted, and he found himself adjusting his hold to support her more fully. She smelled of sweat and blood and milk, the raw, honest sense of childbirth. And somehow, it did not bother him at all. The line shack appeared just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. It was a small structure, barely more than 12 feet square, with rough-hewn log walls and a single window covered with oiled paper. Garrett had spent weeks at a time here during the winter, watching over cattle in the remote northern section of the Patterson Ranch. It was isolated and primitive, but it was shelter. He helped Sarah down carefully and unlocked the door. Inside, it was dusty but intact. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a small table and 2 chairs, a potbelly stove, and shelves that held a few supplies: canned goods, coffee, some flour and beans. Not much, but it would do. "Sit," Garrett ordered gently, guiding Sarah to the cot. She sank down with a grateful sigh, and Daniel stirred against her chest, but did not wake. Garrett busied himself getting a fire started in the stove, hauling water from the nearby creek, and heating it so Sarah could wash properly. He found a clean shirt of his own for her to wear, and tactfully stepped outside while she changed. By the time darkness fell, Sarah was tucked into the cot, with Daniel beside her, in a makeshift cradle Garrett had constructed from a wooden crate and more blankets. Garrett had made a simple meal of beans and coffee, and Sarah had eaten 2 full plates. Now she was drifting off to sleep, her hand resting protectively on her baby's tiny chest. Garrett settled into one of the chairs, watching the fire in the stove and trying to process everything that had happened in the span of a single afternoon. His life had been simple before today. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Now he had a young woman and a newborn baby under his care, and he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. But as he glanced over at Sarah's sleeping face, at the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, he found he did not regret his decision. Not even a little bit. The next few days passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Garrett rode back to the main ranch the following morning to explain the situation to Mr. Patterson, leaving out some of the more complicated details and simply saying he had come across a young woman in need and was providing temporary shelter. Patterson, a weathered man in his 50s with more practicality than sentiment, had raised an eyebrow but not objected. "Just make sure your work does not suffer," he had said gruffly, and Garrett had promised it would not. The reality proved more challenging than Garrett had anticipated. He tried to maintain his regular duties, riding fence, checking on cattle, helping with the spring branding, while also ensuring Sarah and Daniel had everything they needed. He brought supplies from town, proper baby clothes, fabric for diapers, food staples, a few dresses for Sarah that he had awkwardly purchased from the dry goods store, while Mrs. Henderson gave him curious looks. Sarah, for her part, recovered quickly from the birth. She was young and resilient, and within a week she was up and moving around the line shack, insisting on cooking meals and keeping the small space clean. "I will not be a burden," she told Garrett firmly when he protested that she should rest. "You have done so much already. The least I can do is earn my keep." They fell into a routine. Garrett would leave at dawn to work, and Sarah would spend her days caring for Daniel, tidying the cabin, and preparing meals. In the evenings, Garrett would return dusty and tired, and they would eat together while Daniel nursed or slept. At first, their conversations were stilted and awkward, 2 strangers thrust together by circumstances neither had planned for. But gradually, they began to open up. Garrett learned that Sarah had grown up on her family's farm, that she had 2 older brothers who had left years ago to seek their fortunes elsewhere and never returned. She told him about the ranch hand who had seduced her with pretty words and empty promises, about the shame and fear when she realized she was pregnant, about her parents' growing coldness as her belly swelled. She spoke of her grandfather with warmth, recounting stories of how he used to sneak her peppermints and tell her tales of his youth in Missouri. In turn, Garrett shared pieces of his own history. He told Sarah about growing up in New Mexico, about his mother's death from fever when he was 8, about his father's slow descent into alcoholism and violence. He explained how he had left home at 15 with nothing but the clothes on his back and a good horse, how he had worked his way across Texas taking any job he could find, ranch hand, stable boy, even a brief stint as a deputy in a small town near El Paso. "Why did you stop being a deputy?" Sarah asked one evening as she rocked Daniel in her arms. "It seems like steady work." Garrett was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I saw too much ugliness in that job. Men shot over nothing, families torn apart, justice that depended more on how much money you had than what was right or wrong. I prefer working with cattle. They are more honest." Sarah smiled at that, a small, genuine smile that lit up her face. Garrett found himself smiling back, and something warm unfurled in his chest. As the weeks passed, Garrett became increasingly aware of Sarah in ways that had nothing to do with obligation or charity. He noticed the way she hummed while she cooked, old hymns from her childhood. He noticed how her hair, when she let it down at night, fell in dark waves past her shoulders. He noticed her laugh, rare but genuine, when he told her about some of the more comical mishaps that happened around the ranch. He noticed the tender way she spoke to Daniel, the fierce love in her eyes when she looked at her son. And he noticed that she watched him too. Her gaze would linger when he came in from work, sweaty and dirt-streaked. She would smile when he played with Daniel, making faces that made the baby coo and wave his tiny fists. Once, he caught her staring at him with an expression he could not quite decipher, something soft and wondering and almost shy. But Garrett held himself back. Sarah had been through hell. The last thing she needed was another man trying to take advantage of her vulnerability. He slept on the floor, giving her the cot. He kept his distance, never touching her except when absolutely necessary. He was determined to be honorable, even as his feelings for her grew stronger every day. Sarah, meanwhile, was fighting her own internal battle. She had told herself she would never trust a man again, never be foolish enough to believe in love or kindness. But Garrett was making that resolution impossible to keep. He was patient with her, gentle with Daniel, and utterly selfless in a way she had never experienced. He worked grueling hours and then came home to help her with chores, never complaining. He brought her wildflowers once, a simple bouquet of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, just because he thought they were pretty. The gesture had made her cry. She found herself watching him, when he did not know it, admiring the strength in his hands, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the crinkles that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled. She thought about how safe she felt with him, how he had delivered her baby and cared for them both without asking for anything in return. She thought about the way her heart sped up when he walked through the door each evening, but she was terrified. Terrified of being hurt again, terrified of being a burden, terrified that these feelings were one-sided and that she was reading too much into simple kindness. So, she kept her distance too, though it grew harder every day. The turning point came in mid-April, about 6 weeks after that fateful day in the barn. Garrett had been out checking the north pasture and got caught in a late spring storm, not uncommon in Texas, where the weather could turn on a dime. By the time he made it back to the line shack, he was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and his teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak. Sarah took one look at him and went into action. She ordered him out of his wet clothes. He protested weakly but obeyed, changing behind a blanket she hung up, and then bundled him into every dry blanket they had. She made hot coffee and heated water for tea, forcing him to drink both. She stoked the fire in the stove until the small cabin was almost uncomfortably warm. "You are going to catch your death," she scolded, her voice sharp with worry. "What were you thinking, staying out in that?" "Did not have much choice," Garrett managed through chattering teeth. "Cattle were scattered. Had to round them up before they got into the ravines. The cattle are not worth your life." He looked up at her, surprised by the vehemence in her tone. Sarah's face was flushed, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Sarah, no." She sat down beside him on the cot, taking his cold hands in hers and rubbing them briskly. "You cannot do this to yourself. You cannot work yourself to death, trying to take care of me and Daniel and the ranch and everything else. You need to take care of yourself too. I am fine. You are not fine. You are exhausted. I see how hard you work, Garrett. I see how little you sleep, how you give me the best food and eat the scraps, how you never complain, even though I know sharing this tiny space with a woman and a crying baby cannot be easy. I do not mind. I know you do not mind. That is the problem." Sarah's voice cracked, and a tear spilled down her cheek. "You are too good, too selfless, and She stopped, biting her lip. "You what?" Garrett's voice was gentle. He had stopped shivering, though whether that was from the warmth or from her proximity, he could not say. Their faces were very close now. "I do not want anything to happen to you," she whispered. "I cannot lose you, Garrett. I cannot." The admission hung in the air between them. Garrett stared at her, his heart pounding, and slowly raised one hand to cup her cheek. "Sarah?" She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. When she opened them again, they were full of something that made his breath catch. "I know I have no right to feel this way," she said softly. "I know you took us in out of kindness, that you probably want nothing more than to be rid of us as soon as—" He kissed her. It was not something he planned, not something he thought through. He just leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, cutting off her words, and she made a small sound of surprise that quickly turned into something else. Her hands came up to grip his shoulders, and she kissed him back with a desperate intensity that told him everything he needed to know. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I do not want to be rid of you," he said hoarsely. "I have not wanted that from the beginning. Sarah, I care about you, More than I should, probably. More than I have any right to. You have every right, she said fiercely. Garrett, you saved my life. You saved Daniel's life. You have been kinder to me than my own family, than anyone I have ever known. How could I not care about you? I am just a cowboy. I do not have much to offer. You have everything that matters. Sarah pulled back enough to look into his eyes. You have a good heart. You are honorable and brave and compassionate. That is more than most men can claim. Garrett felt something tight and painful in his chest loosen. He had not realized how much he needed to hear those words, how terrified he had been that his feelings were one-sided. I want to do this right, he said carefully. I want to court you properly, Sarah. I want to marry you, if you will have me. I want to be a father to Daniel and give you both a real home. Fresh tears streamed down Sarah's face, but she was smiling. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. They kissed again, softer this time, full of promise and hope. Daniel chose that moment to wake up and start fussing, and they broke apart with shaky laughs. Sarah went to tend to the baby, and Garrett watched her with a sense of wonder that bordered on disbelief. Somehow, in the space of 6 weeks, his entire life had transformed. He had a family now, or he would, once they made it official. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Garrett spoke to Mr. Patterson about building a small cabin on a corner of the ranch property, explaining that he was planning to marry and needed a proper home. Patterson, who had met Sarah once when she had come by with lunch for Garrett, had given his approval. She seems like a good woman, he had said. And that baby of hers needs a father. You are doing a decent thing, Hayes. Garrett also made inquiries in town about a preacher. The local minister, Reverend Thompson, was a kind elderly man who agreed to perform the ceremony without judgment or prying questions. Garrett bought a simple gold band from the jeweler, spending nearly a month's wages on it, and felt no regret. Sarah, meanwhile, was torn between joy and anxiety. She was deeply in love with Garrett, that had become undeniable, but she worried about what people would say when they learned her history. She worried that Garrett would face censure for marrying a woman with an illegitimate child. She worried that she was ruining his life. Garrett dismissed her concerns with a firmness that was both reassuring and frustrating. I do not care what people say, he told her. Let them talk. We know the truth of our situation, and that is all that matters. But your reputation? My reputation is as a hard worker and an honest man. That will not change because I choose to marry you and raise Daniel as my own. Daniel is not your responsibility. Garrett looked at her steadily. He is now. I delivered that boy, Sarah. I held him when he took his first breath. I have been here for every day of his life so far. As far as I am concerned, he is mine in every way that matters. And when we marry, he will be mine legally too. Sarah cried again. She seemed to cry a lot these days, though they were mostly happy tears. Garrett held her and Daniel both, and felt a peace he had not known in years. They were married on a warm Saturday morning in early May at the small church in San Angelo. Sarah wore a simple dress of pale blue that Garrett had bought for her hair braided and pinned up with wildflowers. Daniel, now almost 2 months old and growing stronger every day, slept peacefully in a basket near the altar. Mr. Patterson stood as witness, along with Mrs. Henderson from the dry goods store, who had taken a liking to Sarah during her visits to town. The ceremony was short and straightforward. Reverend Thompson spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of love and commitment. When he asked Garrett if he took Sarah to be his lawfully wedded wife, Garrett's "I do" was firm and clear. When he asked Sarah the same question, her voice trembled, but did not waver. "I do." Garrett slid the gold band onto her finger, and Sarah looked at it with wonder, as if she could not quite believe this was real. Then Reverend Thompson pronounced them man and wife, and Garrett kissed his bride with a tenderness that made Mrs. Henderson dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. After the ceremony, Mr. Patterson invited them all to lunch at the hotel restaurant, his wedding gift to the newlyweds. It was a modest celebration, but Sarah looked happier than Garrett had ever seen her. She kept glancing at her ring, at Garrett, at Daniel, as if trying to commit every detail to memory. As they ate, Mrs. Henderson leaned over and patted Sarah's hand. "You are a lucky girl," she said kindly. "Garrett Hayes is one of the good ones." "I know," Sarah replied softly, meeting Garrett's eyes across the table. "Believe me, I know. The cabin was not finished yet, so they returned to the line shack as a husband and wife. That night, after Daniel had been fed and put down to sleep, Garrett and Sarah lay together on the narrow cot, wrapped in each other's arms. It was the first time they had shared the bed, the first time Garrett had allowed himself to hold her like this, and it felt both natural and miraculous. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly, his lips brushing her temple. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Sarah said. She tilted her head back to look at him. "Are you?" "Yes." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. "I love you, Sarah. I think I have since the moment I saw you on that porch, fighting so hard to survive. I love you too." She smiled against his mouth. "My brave cowboy who saved me and Daniel both." They made love that night with a slow, sweet intensity, learning each other's bodies, whispering words of love and devotion. Afterward, Sarah fell asleep in Garrett's arms, and he lay awake listening to her breathing, to Daniel's soft snuffles from the makeshift cradle, and felt a contentment so profound it almost frightened him. The summer of 1882 was hot and dry, but Garrett barely noticed. He was too busy building his family's future. With the help of some of the other ranch hands, the cabin went up quickly, a sturdy structure with 2 rooms, a real floor, glass windows, and a solid roof. It was not fancy, but it was theirs. Sarah cried when she first saw it, overwhelmed by the realization that she had a real home. They moved in during July, and Sarah immediately set about making the cabin comfortable. She sewed curtains from fabric Mrs. Henderson had given her as a belated wedding gift. She planted a small vegetable garden near the back door. She arranged their few possessions with care. The cot from the line shack became Daniel's bed, and Garrett built a larger bed frame for their room. Daniel was growing rapidly, becoming more alert and interactive. He would smile and coo when Garrett came home from work, and Garrett would scoop him up, marveling at how much the boy had changed in just a few months. "He is going to be big," Garrett said one evening, holding Daniel up and making him giggle. "Look at those legs." "He has your smile," Sarah observed from where she was stirring a pot on the stove. It was true. When Daniel grinned, there was something about the shape of his mouth that reminded her of Garrett. It was coincidence, of course, but it made her heart swell with love for both of them. "Good. He should have something of mine, since he has got your eyes." Sarah laughed. "Garrett, you know he is not actually—" "He is mine," Garrett interrupted firmly. "I do not care about biology, Sarah. Daniel is my son. End of discussion." And that was that. From that day forward, no one questioned it. Garrett introduced Daniel as his boy, and if anyone in town had doubts about the timeline, they kept it to themselves. Garrett's reputation as an honest, hard-working man served him well, and Sarah's quiet grace and obvious devotion to her family won over most of the skeptics. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Garrett worked long days on the ranch, but he always made time for his family. He would come home to find Sarah cooking dinner, Daniel playing on a blanket on the floor, and it never failed to make him smile. In the evenings, they would eat together, and then Garrett would play with Daniel while Sarah cleaned up. Sometimes they would sit outside and watch the sun set over the Texas plains, Sarah leaning against Garrett's shoulder while he held Daniel on his lap. They talked about everything and nothing. Sarah told Garrett her dreams. She wanted to learn to read better, wanted to teach Daniel letters and numbers when he was older, wanted to maybe have a bigger garden someday. Garrett shared his own hopes. He was saving money with the goal of buying his own land eventually, maybe a small ranch where he could raise cattle and horses. They dreamed together of a future full of possibility. But life was not without its challenges. In August, they ran into Sarah's mother in town. Garrett had taken the wagon in for supplies, and Sarah had come along with Daniel. They were loading sacks of flour into the wagon bed when Mrs. Whitmore appeared, her face hard and cold. Sarah. The single word was sharp as a knife. Sarah froze, her arms tightening around Daniel. Garrett moved to stand beside her, his hand going to the small of her back in a gesture of support. "Mama," Sarah said quietly. "Mrs." Whitmore's eyes raked over her daughter, taking in the simple but clean dress, the baby in her arms, the gold band on her finger. "So, you found yourself a husband after all. I am surprised anyone would take soiled goods." Garrett felt rage flash through him, hot and sharp. But before he could say anything, Sarah spoke. "His name is Garrett Hayes, and he is a better person than you or Papa ever were. He loves me and Daniel both, and we have a good life. which is more than I would have had if I had stayed with you. You were always ungrateful, Mrs. Whitmore spat. We raised you, fed you, clothed you, and that is how you repay us? By spreading your legs for the first man who sweet-talked you? That is enough. Garrett's voice was low and dangerous. You do not get to speak to my wife that way. You do not get to judge her, not after what you did. You threw your pregnant daughter out when she needed you most. You are the one who should be ashamed, not her. Mrs. Whitmore's face turned red, but before she could respond, Sarah stepped forward. I do not need you anymore, Mama. I do not need your approval or your forgiveness. I have a family who loves me, who chose me, and that is enough. Goodbye. She turned and climbed into the wagon, and Garrett helped her settle Daniel before going around to the driver's seat. As they pulled away, Sarah did not look back. Garrett glanced over and saw tears on her cheeks, but her expression was resolute. Are you all right? He asked gently. I will be. She wiped her eyes. It hurts, knowing they still hate me. But you were right. I do not need them. I have you and Daniel. I have a real family now. Garrett reached over and squeezed her hand. Always. As the year turned toward autumn, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The realization came with mixed emotions. Joy at the thought of giving Garrett a child of his own blood, but also fear that something might go wrong. She had been lucky with Daniel's birth, if you could call it that, but she knew plenty of women who had not been so fortunate. Garrett, when she told him, was ecstatic. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, then gently set her down and placed his hand on her still flat belly. A baby, he breathed. Sarah, this is wonderful. You are not disappointed? I know we talked about waiting. Disappointed? Are you mad? I am thrilled. He kissed her soundly. Daniel is going to be a big brother. This pregnancy was different from her first in every way that mattered. Sarah had a husband who doted on her, a comfortable home, enough food to eat. Garrett fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more, bringing her little treats from town. He built a proper cradle for the new baby and repaired Daniel's cot. He talked to her belly at night, telling their unborn child stories about the ranch and the horses and all the things they would do together. Sarah bloomed under his care. She felt safer and more loved than ever before, and it showed in her radiant smile, in the way she hummed while she worked. Even Daniel seemed to sense the change, becoming more affectionate, giving her wet kisses on her cheek and patting her growing belly with his chubby hands. Winter came, mild by Texas standards, and Garrett made sure the cabin was snug and warm. He stocked up on supplies so Sarah would not have to make the trip to town in the cold. He taught Daniel to say, Papa, and the first time the boy looked at him and said it clearly, Garrett had to step outside for a moment to compose himself. In March of 1883, almost exactly a year after Garrett had first heard Sarah's scream, their daughter was born. This birth was nothing like Daniel's. It happened at home in their cabin, with a midwife in attendance and Garrett holding Sarah's hand throughout. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Garrett was terrified he would lose her, but Sarah was strong and determined. When the midwife finally placed a squalling, red-faced baby girl in Sarah's arms, Garrett wept with relief. What should we name her? Sarah asked, exhausted but glowing. Garrett looked at his daughter, and she was his, no matter that he had not been there for the beginning, and thought about the past year. He thought about redemption and second chances, about hope rising from despair. How about Grace? He suggested. Because she is a gift we did not expect but needed. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Grace, she repeated softly. Grace Hayes. It is perfect. Daniel, now a sturdy toddler of 11 months, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside Sarah while she nursed and pat Grace's head gently, saying, baby, over and over. Garrett would watch his family, his wife, his son, his daughter, and feel a gratitude so intense it was almost painful. The years that followed were not without hardship. Ranching was hard work, and there were seasons of drought and cattle disease that strained their finances. There were illnesses. Daniel had a bad case of croup one winter that terrified them both, and Grace struggled with colic as an infant. There were moments of doubt and fear, nights when Sarah would wake from nightmares about being thrown out again, days when Garrett wondered if he was doing enough for his family. But through it all, They had each other. They built a life together that was rooted in love and respect and genuine partnership. Sarah learned to read better with Garrett's help, and eventually she was teaching both Daniel and Grace their letters. Garrett saved every penny he could, and by 1885, he had enough to buy a small parcel of land adjacent to the Patterson Ranch. It was only 40 acres, but it was theirs. They built a bigger house on that land, with 3 bedrooms and a proper kitchen and even a small parlor. Sarah planted rose bushes by the front door and a larger vegetable garden out back. Garrett started his own small herd, just a dozen cattle at first, but it was a beginning. Daniel, now 3 years old, followed his father everywhere, already learning about cattle and horses and the land. Grace was a sunny-natured child who laughed easily and loved everyone. In 1886, their third child was born, another boy they named Samuel after Garrett's grandfather. And then, in 1888, twin girls arrived, much to everyone's surprise. They named them Emma and Lily, and the house was suddenly full of noise and chaos and love. Through it all, Garrett and Sarah's bond only deepened. They still had quiet evenings after the children were asleep, when they would sit together on the porch and talk, or sometimes just enjoy the comfortable silence. They still looked at each other across a crowded room and smiled, sharing private jokes and memories. They still made love with a passion that had not dimmed despite the years and the children and the hard work of building a life together. One evening in the spring of 1890, 8 years after that fateful day, Garrett found Sarah standing in the doorway of their home, watching the sunset. The children were inside. Daniel, now 8, was helping Emma and Lily with a puzzle, while Grace read to Samuel. The sounds of their laughter drifted out into the warm evening air. Garrett came up behind Sarah and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," Sarah said softly. "I was thinking about how different my life could have been. If you had not come along that day, if you had just kept riding." She trailed off, shaking her head. "But I did not keep riding." "No, you did not. You saved me, Garrett. You saved Daniel. You gave us both a life and a family and a home." She turned in his arms to face him, her green eyes bright. "I love you so much, more than I could ever put into words." "I love you too." He kissed her gently. "But Sarah, you need to understand something. You saved me too. Before I met you, I was just drifting. I was alive, but I was not living. You and the children, you gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to wake up every morning and work hard and dream big. We saved each other." Sarah smiled, that beautiful smile that still made his heart skip a beat. "I suppose we did." They stood there wrapped in each other's arms as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Inside, their children laughed and played, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and safe. The land around them was harsh and unforgiving, as Texas land often was, but they had carved out a place of beauty and peace and belonging. Daniel, who had been born in a barn in the midst of rejection and fear, grew up strong and confident, never doubting for a moment that Garrett was his true father. He learned to ride and rope and work cattle, and he inherited Garrett's steady nature and Sarah's stubborn determination. When people asked about his family, he spoke with pride about his parents and siblings, and no one who saw them together ever questioned the bond they shared. Grace, sweet Grace, who had been named for the redemption her parents had found, grew into a kind and thoughtful young woman who had her father's patience and her mother's strength. Samuel was adventurous and bold, always exploring and getting into mischief, but with a good heart. Emma and Lily were inseparable, two halves of a whole, both of them bright and curious. As the years continued to pass, the Hayes family became well respected in the community. Garrett's ranch prospered, never making them rich, but providing a comfortable living. Sarah was known for her charity, always ready to help a neighbor in need, never forgetting what it felt like to be desperate and alone. The children thrived, growing up surrounded by love and security. In 1895, when Daniel was 13, a young woman and her family moved to the area. At a church social, Garrett overheard someone making a cruel remark about Sarah's past, about how Daniel had been born out of wedlock. Before Garrett could intervene, Daniel himself stepped forward, his young face set and serious. "That is my mother you are talking about," he said firmly, "and my father. They are the best people I know. I do not care what happened before I was born. What matters is that they love each other and they love us, and they have worked hard to build a good life. If you have a problem with that, that is your problem, not ours." The woman who had spoken looked embarrassed and quickly apologized. Daniel walked away with his head held high, and when Garrett caught his eye across the yard, he nodded approval. Sarah, who had witnessed the exchange from where she was serving refreshments, had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling with pride. That night, after the younger children were in bed, Garrett and Sarah sat with Daniel on the porch. "Thank you for defending us today," Sarah said quietly. "You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Daniel replied simply. "You are my parents. No one gets to talk about you like that." Garrett put a hand on his son's shoulder. "You are going to be a good man, Daniel. You already are." Daniel looked at them both, these two people who had loved him from his very first breath, who had raised him with kindness and discipline and endless patience. "I know I was not born as your son," he said slowly. "Not biologically, I mean. But you are my father, Pa. You are the only father I have ever known or wanted. And Ma, you are the strongest person I know. I am proud to be your son." Sarah pulled him into a fierce hug, and Garrett wrapped his arms around them both. In that moment, any lingering shadows from the past were finally fully banished. The turn of the century brought changes. Daniel left home at 18 to work on a ranch farther north, determined to make his own way before he came back to help run the family spread. He wrote letters regularly, and Garrett and Sarah read them aloud to the younger children, who missed their big brother terribly. Grace, at 17, was being courted by a young man from town, a banker's son with good prospects and a genuine affection for her that Garrett approved of. The younger three were still at home, filling the house with noise and energy. In 1902, 20 years after that day in the barn, Garrett and Sarah celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. It fell on a warm May morning, much like the day they had married, and their children conspired to give them a day to themselves. Daniel, home for a visit, took his siblings into town for the day, leaving his parents alone. Garrett and Sarah spent the morning riding across their land, something they rarely had time to do anymore. They visited all the places that held meaning for them. The line shack where they had first lived together, now used for storage but still standing. The spot where Garrett had first told Sarah he loved her. The creek where they had spent countless evenings talking and dreaming. Finally, they ended up back at the house, sitting on the porch swing Garrett had built years ago. Sarah leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. 20 years, Sarah mused. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you found me on my parents' porch. Other times, it feels like I have known you my whole life. "Best 20 years of my life," Garrett said, pressing a kiss to her hair. Silver was starting to thread through the dark strands, and there were lines around her eyes that had not been there when they met. But to him, she was as beautiful as ever. "Mine too." She lifted her head to look at him. "Do you ever regret it? Taking me in, I mean. Your life would have been so much simpler if you had just kept riding that day. Simpler, maybe, but nowhere near as good." Garrett cupped her face in his hands. "Sarah, you and the children are the best thing that ever happened to me. I have never regretted it, not for a single second. Even on the hardest days, even when money was tight or the children were sick or the cattle were dying. I never wished I had made a different choice." "I am so grateful," Sarah whispered, "for you, for our life, for our family, for the fact that you saw a scared girl in trouble and decided to help instead of looking the other way." "I saw a brave woman fighting for her child," Garrett corrected gently. "I saw someone worth saving, and I was right." They kissed then, a long, slow kiss that held 20 years of love and partnership and devotion. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Should we talk about the future?" Sarah asked. "We are not getting any younger." Garrett chuckled. "I am 46, not ancient. But yes, we should probably think about what comes next. Daniel wants to come back permanently next year, and when he does, I think we should make him a partner in the ranch. He has earned it. He would love that, and Grace is likely to marry William within the year, I think. As long as he treats her right, I am happy for her. He will. He is a good man." Sarah paused. "We are going to have grandchildren soon, Garrett." "I know," he grinned. "I cannot wait. Although it is going to make me feel old." They talked about their plans, about expanding the herd, about maybe hiring some help, so Garrett did not have to work such long hours. They talked about the younger children's education, about eventually passing the ranch down to their children when the time came. They talked about growing old together, about rocking grandbabies on this very porch. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and gold, their children returned home, full of stories about their day in town. The house erupted in happy chaos. Dinner needed to be started. Samuel had torn his trousers and needed them mended. Emma and Lily were arguing over a ribbon they both wanted. Garrett and Sarah exchanged an amused glance and rose to handle the various crises. This was their life, messy and loud and full and perfect. It had started with a scream and a desperate flight, with rejection and pain and fear. But it had transformed into something beautiful, something worth fighting for. That night, after all the children were finally settled and the house was quiet, Garrett and Sarah lay in their bed, wrapped in each other's arms as they had been for 20 years. "Thank you," Sarah whispered into the darkness, "for choosing us, for loving us, for building this life with me." "Thank you for trusting me," Garrett replied, "for taking a chance on a cowboy who had no idea what he was doing but knew he could not leave you behind." "Best decision I ever made." "Mine too." They fell asleep like that, holding each other close, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. The scared young woman and the cowboy who had saved her had built something that would last. Not just a ranch or a house, but a legacy of love and resilience that would be passed down through generations. Daniel eventually took over the ranch with his wife, a strong, capable woman who reminded Garrett of Sarah in many ways. Grace married her William and gave them 4 grandchildren who adored their grandparents. Samuel became a veterinarian, the first in the family to pursue formal education. Anne came back to the area to practice. Emma and Lily, inseparable to the end, married brothers and settled on adjacent properties, raising their families side by side. Through all of it, Garrett and Sarah remained the center, the foundation upon which their family was built. They grew old together gracefully, their hair turning white, their steps slowing, but their love never diminishing. They sat on that porch swing and watched their grandchildren play in the yard, and they remembered that day in March of 1882 when their lives had collided in the most unexpected way. On a spring morning in 1920, Garrett woke to find Sarah lying still beside him. She had passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 58, her hand still resting in his. The grief nearly broke him, but he found solace in their children and grandchildren, who surrounded him with love and support. He lived another 5 years, and when he finally joined Sarah, he was buried beside her in the small cemetery on their land, under a marker that read, "Garrett and Sarah Hayes, beloved parents and grandparents together forever." Their children gathered after the funeral, sitting in the house their parents had built, sharing memories and stories. Daniel, now a grandfather himself, told his children and grandchildren about the day his mother had been in labor and his father had delivered him in a barn, about how Garrett had taken them in and made them a family. He spoke of the love and sacrifice that had defined his parents' marriage, of the strength it took to build a life from nothing but determination and devotion. "They saved each other," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ma always said Pa saved her and me, but he said she saved him too. They were 2 people who found each other when they needed it most, and they built something beautiful together. That is the legacy they left us, not just this ranch or this land, but the knowledge that love can overcome anything if you are willing to fight for it." The Hayes family continued to thrive for generations, always remembering the story of how it all began. It became family legend, passed down from parent to child, the tale of a young woman in desperate straits and a cowboy who chose compassion over convenience, who saw someone in need and decided to help. It was a story of second chances and unexpected love, a family forged not by blood alone, but by choice and commitment. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Garrett and Sarah were together still, holding hands and smiling at the life they had created, at the ripples of love and kindness that continued to spread outward from that single decision on a dusty Texas afternoon. They had taken the worst moment of Sarah's life and transformed it into a beginning, and the story of their love remained a testament to the power of human goodness, of choosing to help rather than to judge, of building something lasting from the wreckage of loss. Their story was the Wild West at its best, not the violence and lawlessness that dominated the history books, but the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, of communities built on hard work and mutual support, of families created through love rather than convention. It was a story that deserved to be remembered, told around dinner tables, and passed down through generations as a reminder that even in the hardest of times, even when the world seems cruel and unforgiving, there is always room for compassion, always the possibility of redemption, always the chance that one person's choice to help can change everything. Garrett Hayes had been just a cowboy riding past a farmhouse on an ordinary March day in 1882. He could have kept riding, most people would have, but he had heard a woman scream and decided it was his business after all, and that decision had led to a lifetime of love and family and purpose. It had given Sarah Whitmore a chance at a real life instead of death or destitution, had given Daniel a father who loved him unconditionally, had created a family that would span generations. In the end, that is what mattered, not the hardships they had faced or the judgment they had endured, but the fact that they had found each other and refused to let go. They had taken their separate broken pieces and forged them into something whole and beautiful. They had loved fiercely and completely, had raised their children with patience and wisdom, had built a legacy that would outlast them by decades. The house still stood on that 40 acres of Texas land, weathered by time but sturdy, lived in by Daniel's descendants. The porch swing where Garrett and Sarah had spent countless evenings was long gone, replaced by newer furniture, but the spot where it had hung was still there. Sometimes, on quiet spring evenings, when the wind was just right, you could almost hear the creak of old wood and the soft murmur of voices talking about dreams and plans and love. The barn where Daniel had been born, that rough shelter that had witnessed both the cruelty of rejection and the birth of redemption, eventually collapsed in a storm in the 1930s. But everyone in the family knew its significance, and they made sure the story was never forgotten. It became a touchstone, a reminder of where they had come from and what their family stood for. And Daniel, the baby who had entered the world in such difficult circumstances, lived a long and happy life. He had Garrett's steady strength and Sarah's fierce determination, and he raised his own children with the same love and acceptance he had received. When he was an old man and his grandchildren would ask him to tell them about his parents, he would smile and begin, "My father was the bravest man I ever knew, and my mother was the strongest woman. This is how they met." The story would unfold. The screams, the rejection, the barn, the cowboy who stopped to help, the baby born into hardship but raised in love. The children would listen wide-eyed, marveling at the thought of their great-grandparents beginning, and Daniel would finish the same way every time. "They taught me that family is not just about blood. It is about who chooses you, who stays with you, who loves you even when things are hard. My father chose me before I was even an hour old. He chose my mother when everyone else had abandoned her. That is what real love looks like." It was a lesson that carried through the generations of the Hayes family, that love is a choice, that family is built through action and commitment, that the most important thing you can do in life is to help someone when they need it most. It was a lesson born in a barn in San Angelo, Texas, in March of 1882, when a cowboy heard a woman scream and decided to care. And so, the story of Garrett and Sarah Hayes lived on, a tale of the Wild West that captured not gunfights or gold rushes, but something far more valuable, the triumph of compassion over cruelty, the power of love to heal and transform, the beauty of two broken people finding wholeness in each other. It was a story that started with rejection and fear, but ended with love and family and peace. It was a story of how one good deed could ripple outward through time, creating waves of love and kindness that would touch lives for generations. It was, in short, a story worth telling, and as long as there were Hayes descendants to remember it, it would never be forgotten. The cowboy who stopped to help, and the woman he saved would live on in memory, their love a beacon lighting the way for all who came after, proving that even in the darkest moments, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of rescue. There is always love waiting to be found, if only you are brave enough to reach for it. Garrett and Sarah had reached for each other across the gulf of fear and uncertainty, and they had held on tight through 20 years of marriage and 5 children and countless challenges. They had built a life that was rich not in material wealth, but in the things that truly mattered: love, family, purpose, belonging. They had created a home where all were welcome, where mistakes were forgiven, where love was freely given and gratefully received. And on that spring morning in 1882, when a young cowboy had heard a desperate scream and turned his horse toward the sound instead of away from it. He had set in motion a chain of events that would echo through time. He had saved 2 lives that day, Sarah's and Daniel's both. But in doing so, he had also saved himself, finding the purpose and meaning he had been searching for, without even realizing it. That was the magic of love, the real Wild West story that deserved to be told. Not the quick-draw shootouts or the cattle drives, though those had their place. But this, the story of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, of compassion winning out over judgment, of families formed through love and maintained through dedication. This was the story that mattered, the one that would be told and retold until the last Hayes descendant drew their final breath. And somewhere, in the great mystery beyond life, Garrett and Sarah danced together still, young again and whole, smiling at the beautiful thing they had created together. Their love had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger. It had weathered storms and droughts and losses and fears. It had grown and deepened and evolved, but it had never faltered, never failed, never dimmed. From a barn in San Angelo to a legacy spanning generations, from a moment of crisis to a lifetime of love, this was the story of Garrett and Sarah Hayes, the cowboy and the woman he saved who saved him right back. It was a story of the Wild West, yes, but more than that, it was a story of the human heart in all its courage and resilience and boundless capacity for love. And it was a story that ended not in tragedy or loss, but in triumph, in children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, carrying forward the legacy of love that had begun with one man's choice to help a stranger in need. It was a story that ended with peace and fulfillment and the knowledge that a life well lived leaves ripples that never truly fade. It was, in every sense that mattered, a happily ever after, the kind earned through sacrifice and hard work and unwavering devotion, the kind built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership, the kind that proved beyond any doubt that love really could conquer all, even rejection, even fear, even the harsh, unforgiving landscape of West Texas in the 1880s. Garrett Hayes had delivered a baby in a barn and kept both mother and child. He had married Sarah Whitmore and made her Sarah Hayes. He had raised Daniel as his own son and given him 4 siblings. He had built a ranch and a home and a family that would last for generations. He had lived a good life, a full life, a life that mattered, and it had all started with a scream, a choice, and a cowboy brave enough to stop and help. That was the story. That was the legacy. That was love.